Now, to start off with on the newspaper review, John, we've got this story. It was a recording of Rishi Sunak, which he said that he's sort of bragging about taking money from urban areas and bringing it into rural areas when he was doing a speech to some people in the Tory hustings or something. Do you think this has just shown up the Tories and that they can't actually they've got no credibility now? I mean, this guy Rishi isn't probably going to win, but does that show up the Tories for being two-faced all the way?
Yeah, it shows them up generally. I mean, this is part of the war that's going on between, the two Muppets who are running for PM. But we've known, this is no surprise, we've known that they've been redistributing not wealth, but funding from poorer areas to richer areas. And I accept that in these so-called prosperous areas, there's still pockets of poverty, but we've known about it. It's part, as I say, of that upward redistribution. And, we see Lisa Nandy saying, we want it distributed fairly. There's nothing fair about Tories under capitalism and funding. We've had 12 years of absolute attacks upon our people. 12 years of this thing called austerity, where all our areas have been starved and funded. So we've got to stop calling these areas of deprivation. It sounds like they've done something wrong themselves. This is capitalism inflicted poverty. And the sort of areas I come from, we've seen libraries closed, community facilities having to be run by volunteers as councils, most of them Labour councils, yes, Labour councils, to paraphrase that bastard Kinnock. They're struggling, and all the time Eton is still a charity and still receives funding from taxpayers. The whole idea, you remember Bozo in his campaign levelling up the north, that were only to appease and keep people happy as this so-called red wall had collapsed. In reality, they have stuffed the mouths of their donors. The pandemic was a classic example of that. Widespread fraud, money just chucked at people who had no knowledge of what they were doing purely because they were Tories and donors to the Tory party. Nah, you can't see a doctor. You're lucky if you get a telephone appointment. The whole fabric of society has crumbled. And we always have to go back. We had a chance, a once in a lifetime, perhaps, well, twice in my lifetime chance of standing up to this. And the people inside the Labour Party, the PLP in particular, destroyed that. And look where we've ended up. We've ended up with in literally a national government where we've got a sterile opposition that won't fight back. And all the time, our people are getting poorer and poorer and are having to struggle more. We're going to see massive increases in energy costs from companies that we used to own, and not a whimper of real opposition. Time to take to the streets and start fighting back, because it's only going to get worse.
Oh, thank you, John. Yeah, I mean, he's just shown up what we already knew. He got recorded saying something that we kind of already suspected. So
yeah.
It's not really a story in some ways. Jackie, this is the Observer. The Observer today is full of this. The front page: set emergency budget or risk a winter of dire poverty. Ex-PM Gordon Brown warns of financial time bomb. Labour plans major intervention. And then he's got a whole page as well inside. Fuel poverty is creating a left-out generation. Do you think Gordon Brown has the answer? Do you think Gordon Brown has been given a status beyond what he should have? What's your view on Gordon Brown as this, the man to lead us out of this?
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because let's remember what Brown was doing when there was the Blair government. But he's transcended that now, and he's gone back to his Presbyterian roots. And I'm being slightly cynical, but not that cynical about it, of course, because he actually does believe this. He actually does believe that the poverty of people is awful, which is a darn sight more than you're getting from Johnson and Starmer, who are still on holiday. I mean, can you imagine? This is the very time when you should have strong opposition voices. I know they're on holiday, but honestly, why isn't the opposition there nailing this government, nailing the leadership contest that's going on at the moment? It's an open goal. They are not there. And let's look at the figures they're talking about here within these articles. 4 million people are going to spend, 4 million households are going to spend more than a quarter of their income on energy. You're talking about fuel poverty is going to affect, I couldn't really believe this when I read it first of all, something like 54% of the country. It's going to take up a third of statutory pensions. And of course, this was sort of known before when they set the rates for benefits. They set the rates for the benefit at last year's rates when inflation was low. And this slips into the other stories, of course, because here we have the degradation of our government, which is now so simply for the rich. And we see the morality of both sides opened up to be the dross that they are. And the one thing I hope that comes out of this, because it is time for people to just be on the streets. And when people are hungry and when people are cold, that might actually happen, because there is one way, this is being proved now, proved beyond doubt. The electoral system at the moment is not working. There is one way to change it. Every time there are protests on the streets, what they call riots, there is some change, because it scares them shitless when their property is attacked, when they say people standing up and saying no. And we're coming very close, I think, to a time when we're going to see people on the street, because people will not just stay and be hungry and be freezing.
Yeah, and a bit like in Sri Lanka, obviously, we saw that what happened there. They just, even if you've got a repressive regime that gives you no possible way of expressing protest, people just say, we'll sod that protesting. So yeah, I mean, the government's obviously prepared for that, isn't it, with all this legislation on police powers.
That's what it's all about. But if the mass of people come out and protest, they can't do anything. They cannot control the masses, and that's what they're scared about. And with it, talking about, and I'm concerned about using this hackneyed phrase, but I'm beginning to see a build-up of such a crisis of capitalism, and they know it's going to happen. You look at all those meetings the big boys have been happening. They know that we're heading towards this with the climate change stuff as well, and they're still looking for ways that they can get out of it. There is no way out. This is a crisis. Right.
Thank you, Jackie. John, the next story is obviously not reported very often. This is the left-hand story is in the Morning Star, which suggests that Ukraine was shelling journalists who were in Donetsk. I mean, you don't hear that Ukraine has done anything wrong at all in this war. The next story next to it is Amnesty's chief in Ukraine has quit a report that she brands war propaganda. Amnesty is being accused of touting for Putin and Russia and giving propaganda by criticizing Ukraine in any way. Are we just not going to get the balanced truth about this? Is it impossible to have the truth on this? It just seems so one-sided. I mean, the Morning Star is just on its own on this, surely.
Well, didn't somebody once say the first casualty of war is truth? And everything that's going off in this area is shrouded by a fog of untruth. And, you know, thank God that the Lioness's victory for, you know, and other issues worldwide have took Ukraine off mainstream news. Ukraine was labeled the most corrupt country in Europe. I think we have to start from that. It's being seen as a Western imperialism outpost on the edge of Russia. And the Donetsk region, as I understand, is part of a whole disputed region where Donbass, parts of it have been, if you listen to the media, captured by Russian separatists. And the reality is that in war, all sorts of atrocities happen from both sides. We have to understand that. And it's a common tactic to use hospitals, to use schools, to use innocent civilians as human shields. And now we've got both sides claiming that this bombing was done by each other, and it's impossible. Unless you look, there's a lot of great alternative media talking about this, journalists, especially US journalists, who have been silenced, whose YouTube channels have been taken down for standing up and exposing the truth. Now, I don't have any allegiance or support for Amnesty International since they abandoned the Shrewsbury pickets way back in the 70s under pressure from a government. But when even the local head of Amnesty International resigns because of what she claims is war propaganda, only then to be attacked as a Russian asset, as anybody is who tries to talk about the truth. I've gone on online discussions, and if you start talking about any negativity about Zelensky and his regime, you're obviously a Putin apologist. And it's unfortunately now this black and white world. And the only way that the Ukraine war will be stopped is by negotiations. It's in particularly the US imperialists, it's in their benefit to keep it going, because you know the military industrial complex are making a fortune out of that. And in these so-called times of austerity, we've got money as always to throw into war. And unless, as I say, proper negotiations and discussions, and the West steps aside and lets this be resolved, and the whole area has been disputed since the downfall of the USSR, especially the Donetsk region, especially, and let's never forget the 2014 coup against an elected prime minister backed by CIA and Western imperialism. So we've got to look through this fog of untruth and start saying, and it's up to people like us to start talking in real terms about what's going on in Ukraine, that Zelensky's no sort of hero, that both sides are complicit in war crimes.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's just not balanced. It's like one side is the villain totally, and the other one's an angel. It's like
it's always been the same wherever conflict has broken out. And unfortunately, our so-called independent media are hand in glove with a corporate machine in selling us these mistruths.
Right, thank you, John. Jackie, the last story for the news review is China continues army drills over US provocation. Taiwan, I mean, Pelosi going to Taiwan just seems such an inflammatory thing to do. And, you know, can you make head or tail of what's going on here? I mean, do they want war? Does America want war? What's happening?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and my view now has been really informed. You know, I've seen things very differently from the experience of having visited China about 3 times in the last 10 years. But what's behind the awful, corrupt Pelosi, the multi-millionairess who has made so much money out of wars, going to Taiwan, which she says is all about defending freedom. She says this, by the way, joke, as Gaza is being pummeled with arms that are paid for by the US, by a regime which is actually supported by the US. And of course, the US is the prime imperialist in the world and the prime power who has undermined democratic governments across the world. So what's behind it? Forget that this is actually about freedom. Because one thing I know, and to me, this is reminiscent of when Muhammad Ali actually refused to go and fight in Vietnam. And he said, basically, he said, you know, they've never done anything to me. You know, they didn't enslave me. You know, they haven't been beating me up and burning me and lynching me. It's not the Chinese who've been doing that. So what's behind this? Well, if you look at a map of China and have a look at a map that shows US bases that surround China, it is extraordinary. I wouldn't be surprised that they're feeling anxious, particularly given America's history on this. And let's be straight about China. Now, China has got problems with its human rights, but has it got more problems than many of the regimes which America and Britain support, like the Saudis, like Israel, like many others that they actually support? One thing I know is that in the 10 years that I visited China, I saw them hugely advancing materials so that nobody is starving in China, unlike in this country. People do not go cold in China. Everybody now has an education. This is an extraordinary thing that's happened. That doesn't mean that I don't look at what's happened in Tibet, for example, or with the Uyghurs, and actually am very, very disturbed about what they do. But this is the nut of it. And I'll tell you, this is the nut of it. And it links to your story about China, and it links to what's happening in this country. There is one reason that China is going to become the world power, or set to become the world power. In China, the government doesn't plan for 3 or 4 years. It doesn't dance around like we see our executive doing, depending on a few nutcases who will vote them in, like we see with the Tories, and vying for all these short-term policies which don't address the actual structural problems which we are faced with. It doesn't do the short-term sort of factionalism stuff, whatever. It has its own factions, of course. But what they have is 30 and 40 and 50 years of economic planning. And that's what's going to put them into power. Yes, they have a capitalist structure that's going on, but their wider economic plan is over 30 and 40 and 50 years. And that's what's going to defeat so-called European and American democracies. And that's what the US and Europe is terrified of, because they know it. And all of this, Pelosi going over, that's not because she's interested in freedom. That's not because Taiwan was under any other extra threat now than it ever was. It's because they are getting us ready to be in this state of forever war, whether it's with Russia, who are really pretty much a sideline at the moment, or the coming actual threat to their imperial power, which is China. Just like Israel needs a forever war, America and Europe need their forever enemies, big brother like, and that's what this trip of Pelosi's is about.
Wow, I always learn a lot when you speak, Jackie. Thank you very much for coming on and sharing your thoughts, both of you. Thank you, John. Hope you have a good day, John. Good luck. And thanks, Jackie.